of the subjects at .05 and below scored as impaired. About 78% of the test subjects were dosed to either a BAC of .15 or higher or a BAC of .05 or lower. Where I came from, those are called gimmies, right? And so with all those gimmies in there, they were still at 32% error rate. The sample population, again, was 2/3 male and about 80% were 21 to 34. It's easier to find male drinkers. So now they started the field studies, the Colorado study in 1995. The field study was conducted by NHTSA. The average BAC, a low .152. Now, is there anybody here who don't think they can figure out a .152 by looking at them? I mean, come on, anybody? I mean, the guy's a .152. That's the mean BAC.
That's
So,
the average.
that's the average. So you got folks above a 1.5. The participants were now trained law enforcement officers who got a refresher course right before they started the study. 305 participants, but only complete data for 234, and no explanation as to where the other data went. It's not there. I looked. It's not there. And not only did I look, but Lance looked, and Rob Lloyd looked, and now Josh Ott has looked because he didn't believe me. It's hard to teach a cop. But it's not there. The data's not there. NHTSA's never said where it went to. The observers were present and collected data via PBT for 125 of the subjects, but the report doesn't indicate how the other 109 were collected or by whom. The author of the report did not release the BAC along with the SFST data as part of the final report, so you didn't have a side-by-side comparison, which makes it really hard to correlate things. 1/2 of the officers participating were both the officer and the observer at different times, so they had two roles, which raises all kinds of conflict of interest issues, right? You know, that's kind of the, hey buddy, I'll tell you what's gonna happen. You're gonna go out here and you're gonna do this, and I'm gonna score you, and later it's gonna be reversed. So you don't do me wrong, I won't do you wrong. You think that's a real good way to do these tests? Come on. False positive rate is still 24%. So they're getting better because they're training their officers up and they're giving them all kinds of advantages, right? The BAC median, again, was a .152. Then we get to the Florida study. Again, conducted by NHTSA, BAC, .15 is the average. The average BAC of the released subjects was a .031. The false positive rate was 18%, and the data was skewed because disproportionate use of high and low BAC dose subjects. There was no blinding performed, which is a huge issue in these tests when you have median BACs that are that high. And that's especially an issue with horizontal gaze nystagmus. There's no reason not to blind HGN, right? If all we're looking at is the eyes, other than making sure where the stimulus is on the human body, which they can do by putting a designated zone on a sheet in front of the person and having them breathe through a tube, there is no reason they can't blind that study. NHTSA said, when I asked, Dr. Carl Siddick is who I actually asked, so I'll name him personally. He said, well, blinding isn't really something that is able to be done easily. How the hell is that not easy? It's a sheet and a piece of tube. They don't really have a good answer for that. The officers had a PBT available to them in the field. I mean, how fair is that? So they came up with the last study, and this is the one that they are now using the most in the manual, the 1998 San Diego study. This study, again, conducted by NHTSA on about 300 stops. 91% claimed accuracy of the officers in the final report. The study involved 297 participants, because some said no. The BACs were obtained for all the 297 participants, even though one refused to give a BAC, so we're not sure how that happened. The officers were chosen from those who volunteered, so that means they're more eager, and they were assigned exclusively to DUI task force or DUI units. They were given an SFST refresher prior to starting the study, and there were both monitored and unmonitored stops and no data marking for comparison, the monitored versus the unmonitored, so you don't know which data is one versus the other. The officers could, therefore, if they wanted to, and I'm not saying they did because there's no way to tell, but if they wanted to manipulate the data on the unmonitored stops, they could have, and there'd be no way to tell based on what was given as part of the report. The authors treated any false positives over a .07 as if they were over a .08. Government math. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but it's still government math. The scores for the 3 different SFSTs were combined with no methodology for how that's done. And the stated VAC test has a margin of error of .01, which is why they gave them the benefit of the doubt on the .07. But there's no citation of authority for why that's the margin of error for the VAC test. They said HGN is 88% reliable, but they didn't account for the 37% false positives that were not reported. They said walk and turn is 79% reliable, but they didn't account for the 53% that are not reported false positives. And they said the one leg stand is 83% reliable, but they didn't account for the 21% false positives that's reported. And that's in the final report data on page 21 of the data. Now, if those false positives that high are there, then these numbers are a lie. They're a fraud. And what I'm suggesting to you is when you put that kind of evidence in front of the jury, that starts to say something about the integrity of the state. You're telling us that this is true. Make them tell us why it's true. But how many trials have you seen or been involved in where nobody talked about this, where a claim of that reliability was put forward? And here's the other thing. I listen to troopers, especially troopers, and they're trained this way. It's not the troopers' fault, but they testify constantly that 6 out of 6 on HGN, or 2 of 8 on walk and turn, or 2 of 4 on one leg stand correlates to impairment. It does not. It does not, it has not, it never has since 1977 and before been correlated to an impairment. That is untrue. That is a lie. It has been correlated through SCRI to a percentage reliability of a VAC over a certain number. And if you talk and if you get into it with them enough, and if you get into it with the founders of those studies, they would tell you that the only way to correlate impairment is this is the number, and they leave it up to the police officer to give the manifestations to correlate to impairment. And we know that the number doesn't really matter for impairment because Handley versus the state told us that. Because individual responses to alcohol may vary, the number is not relevant in a less safe case, right? So there's no correlation of these numbers to impairment, and when they say that, that's another fraud. I don't think they know they're doing it. I don't think local cops know they're doing it. I don't think the city cops know they're doing it, because most police officers, truthfully, are just good guys. They really are. I never went out, and I know most cops don't go out to do anybody any wrong. I mean, come on, they don't get paid enough to do people wrong. They go out trying to do whatever they can do with the tools that they're given. But when you're only given half the story when you go out on the road, and you don't actually see this evidence, and you don't know what this evidence is, and you think you're doing the right thing, you're going to argue convincingly because you have that feeling you're taking drunk drivers off the road. I love my Mad Pens when I was a cop. They're nice and shiny. They look good. The tests are performed under imperfect conditions. There is no perfect place in this state to stop a vehicle. When you do stop a person, you turn on your lights, and half the dang time they go somewhere you didn't expect them to go anyway. The lab conditions don't exist on the side of the roadway. NHTSA says the walk and the turn and the one leg stand should be performed on a dry, relatively level, I don't know what that means, non-slippery surface that is well lighted. How do you explain to a jury what relatively level is? Because they know relatively level roadway in Georgia, right? You put a ball on it, it rolls. All right? Because they're sloped for runoff to begin with, they're crested. And most of Georgia's got some hills. So I usually ask, if you a relatively nice mama and you put your baby in the stroller, would you expect it to roll? If it was going to roll, it's not relatively level, right? You trust your baby rolling down the hill? That's how I determine the Bible. Weather conditions can affect standardized field sobriety tests. You see them out there in the rain and snow and the blowing wind doing field sobriety tests, complaining they're cold. All of that's going to have an effect on muscles. And lastly, field sobriety tests are performed on imperfect people. Anybody ever have the perfect client? I mean, dude's a gymnast, 21 years old, never been in trouble. He's probably not out drinking at 12 o'clock, right? He's in the gym in the morning at 5 in the morning. And if he was out drinking, he's got all kinds of knee and ankle issues from the 10 times he banged on the pommel horse. In the eyes of the law, all people are created equally, but this isn't true for field sobriety tests. People have physical limitations, mental limitations. Some people are just uncoordinated. I don't care if she does look like the prom queen. Some girls just ain't coordinated. ADHD and ADD, I mean, they give those pills out like candy nowadays. Stress, fatigue, age, shift workers, all of these things can affect field sobriety tests. In order to get through to a not guilty verdict, you kind of got to assess your case, right? And there's the common sense approach, and there's the attack them on the field sobriety test evidence approach. I do both. It depends on the jury, it depends where I'm at. You know, some of this math stuff, if I'm up in Pickens County, most people aren't going to get it. But the math is important when the trooper or when the officer brings it up for you to be able to slap them down. Officer, you said that this test is 88% reliable. Let's look at the data. Here is all the data from that 1998 San Diego study. You'd agree with me there's a 32% false positive rate. Here, let me underline all these. Right? Well, at that point, either he's